talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How you doing?
All right. I'm good. Yourself?
Living the dream, baby.
I can't believe it's already the middle of June.
I know. We had weather in the 70s this week. It was fantastic.
Yeah, that was in Georgia, right? So, and I'm in the Chicago area. We had some fantastic weather too. So it's been quite nice.
Yeah, you don't get this every year, so you got to enjoy it while it's here.
Plus, we're home because we're not really traveling right now. So, that's even better, I guess.
And I spent the last, 15 of the last 20 years complaining about how much traveling I do, and now I'm starting to really miss it.
The heart wanders and
Yes.
yearns for the airlines and the delicious airline food.
Chicken or steak?
I will go with chicken.
There you go.
So today for a topic, we have one that's actually listener submitted. Our friend Andrew C. He writes, as I was listening to your podcast and my current everyday work, I was wondering if you guys would do a podcast on lesson learned from past role mining engagements. Craziest requests, for example, had to figure out how to consolidate up to 400,000 role entitlement combinations, things you could have done differently, and tips for analysts like myself and what to look for or approaches to take, which I think sounds like an awesome topic. What do you think?
I think it's a great topic. I mean, every client we work with, they want to achieve this vision of RBAC. There's a couple ways to get there. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of foundational elements, but eventually you end up in this place called role mining, which we're going to get into pretty heavily today.
Yeah. And to help us with that conversation, we've brought in another member of the crack Identropian IAM team. He's Helio Gomez, IAM Architect Extraordinaire. Welcome, Helio.
Hi, Jim and Jeff. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Helio, where are you located right now? You're in Florida?
I am in Tampa, Florida. Just got back here.
Okay.
So we're wondering
gonna
what's causing the spike in cases. Now we know.
Absolutely. No, I've been back out here for a week. I've spent my last 3 months in Los Angeles here.
So you went from one hotspot to another.
Absolutely.
So are you a super spreader? Is that what we're saying, Jim? Are we
I think so. I think Helio's been going around licking doorknobs everywhere he went.
I'm in self-quarantine. So.
Well, I'm glad you're able to join us because you've been working on this stuff for a long time, and I think your insight's going to be very valuable. And hopefully, Andrew gets something out of this, and other people are listening as well. But before we dive into that topic, just want to make a note that Identiverse started this week. I should be. Let's see, today's Thursday, actually. So I was supposed to be flying to London today because I was going to cut short the trip because I was supposed to go watch Chicago Cubs play the St. Louis Cardinals in London Stadium in London, but that has obviously been canceled. So quite disappointed about that at this point, but I would have been in Denver otherwise for the Identiverse conference, but now it's all virtual. So it started this week. Listened to a few of the different presentations so far. It's going pretty well. Jim, have you listened to any yet?
I haven't tuned in to anything yet, but definitely planning to. I mean, I love conferences not just for the sessions, but for the rubbing elbows. Since we're not rubbing elbows with people anymore, I guess we still have the sessions. So I'm going to get in there and dive in as soon as possible.
Yeah. So check out Ian Glazer had one earlier this week, and his big pronouncement was that SAML was dead. And I don't want to go into it because I want to steal his thunder, but he made some good points around it. And give that a little tease in case someone wants to check that out on the Identiverse website.
Sounds like we have a topic for a few episodes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wish he had made that pronouncement right before our last episode, which was with Eve, and we were talking about SAML and kind of why it's still important.
Well, that's why it's such an interesting topic, because it's a little of a clickbaity headline.
Maybe we should have like a versus episode and get Eve and Ian on at the same time. They can just, duke it out over SAML. They're too much friends with each other to duke it out, though. But it would be an interesting dialogue, I think.
I'd like to do something like a versus, defend your position, maybe a debate or something like that. I think that would be cool. I think if, maybe we'll put that out there. If you have somebody who's listening and wants to take part in something like that or has an idea, maybe we can put something together to like that with maybe some help from the listeners. And, if that's something that you find interesting, email us at questions@identityatthecenter.com, and, we'll see what comes out of it. Speaking of emailing us, I got a really nice note from Craig in New Zealand, from the future. So, saying that he's a listener. He's been listening for, the last year or so, which is great. And we're coming up on our year anniversary. And that was a nice thing to receive, especially when it comes from the future. The New Zealand time
by
zone.
the future, you meant it was timestamped June 19th when he sent it from his home.
Yep.
And then as it traveled the microseconds to a different time zone, it landed in June 18th.
Yeah. So I don't know what happened. I mean, I read it. What happens to me? Do I is this a Back to the Future episode? Do I, disappear from the picture, or?
You've broken the space-time continuum.
That's it. All right. Well, why don't we get into?
We jump into it. Yeah. I'm ready, man. This is an exciting topic. So I think we probably ought to start and get Helio started here. Get him talking a little bit. So why don't we start with just what is role mining, Helio?
So I think of role mining as really analyzing the entitlements that you have within your identity system across all of your applications, analyzing those, getting a combination of what may possibly be connected based on different features about the user, different attribute sets, and what possibly could be a role. And then once we take the output of that, we very simply can build our roles off of what we see from the mining out.
Yes, absolutely. So it's kind of analytic driven, the systems doing the process to kind of come up with, hey, these combination of entitlements are held by people who have this in common. So maybe these 7 accounts and entitlements belong to 95% of the people who are in the HR department. Would you like to turn this into a role? And then you can apply your human evaluation toward whether or not that's a good idea. Is that what you would say?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And what I'd like to do is contrast that with what I call role engineering. And so this is kind of I consider role mining to be kind of bottoms up, using the data to determine a result. And when I think of tops down role engineering, it's, hey, we know that people fit a grouping of they work in HR, and we know that everybody who works in HR needs access to these few systems and needs this level of access. So let's create a role that when somebody new joins HR, we automatically give them that role. Or we start to say that, there are 5 different types of users that use this application or these sets of applications, and let's create a role that bundles all that access together so that, the business users don't have to pick out all the individual entitlements that they need to do their job. They can just pick 1 role or 2 roles. Is that kind of the way you think of it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the interesting things about role mining as well is those roles that you've engineered, when you go and do your role mining analysis, you may find that what you thought was a role that you should engineer really isn't, or what you thought wasn't should. So it's really taking those two, like you said, taking your human element and applying that to the output of your role mining that's really going to be the most beneficial.
Right. Yeah. It's like RBAC as a discipline is more of an art than a science, or maybe it's just a combination of the two.
I think between role mining and role engineering, the way that I like to describe it is it's a technical way to create a logical construct. Technical in the mining aspects, logical in the engineering of how that would look at a construct level.
Absolutely. So Andrew asked us to point out kind of crazy examples, and he said, you're looking for role mining to actually consolidate 400,000 entitlements. So I guess I'll throw it back to Helio. Is that how role mining works? Is it actually consolidate entitlements?
It does to an extent. Really, what I like to think of how roles are going to function in my system, it's not so much consolidating the underlying entitlements, it's obfuscating them. So you take those groups of entitlements that are, they might be AD groups or some field in a column in a database or something along those lines, and permission sets of whatever applications. Your typical end user is not going to have any understanding of what that means. So building your roles is really going to give you that like end user facing like verbiage that's going to be helpful to them to really understand what they're dealing with, what they're requesting, what they're approving, what they're certifying. So building those roles is really help you in that aspect more than anything else, I find. And consolidation, of course, is one of the things that we're going to get from that. Is we're going to have 400,000 entitlements, and we're going to maybe put those into maybe 100,000 roles, or maybe 50 roles, or maybe 500 roles. But really what you're trying to do is make it data that can be consumed by your end user, that can then be used in the other processes that we're going to have in our IAM system.
Yeah, that's really important. I think, an important part of that is wrapping metadata around roles. So in other words, defining a friendly business name or friendly business description around a role, or defining an owner of a role who gets to decide, be part of the approval process or part of the review process for who gets that role. I wanted to make another point about roles, because this is kind of one of the internal debates that I have in my head. A lot of our clients, one of the first things we like to do is take a look at their information security policies. And a lot of times those clients have the principle of least privilege as one of their security policies. And if taken literally, that means that you don't give somebody access that they don't need. Now, if the system does an analysis and tells me that 95% of the people in HR have all these accesses, do you want to give it to the other 5% of people? Say, if I follow least privilege, the answer is no. Or unless it's 100%, I don't want to do it because they don't need it, or they would have already asked for it, or doing their job without it. So part of me says, if you're following least privilege, don't do that. But then the counter argument to that is, well, should they follow least privilege for every type of access? Or is it a burden on the business now to manage access, and really least privilege is more applicable when it comes to privileged access, or, powerful access, however we want to define that. And I think that's, I guess where I'm coming down recently is that I think is a more appropriate use of the principle of least privilege, is to apply it only for privileged access or administrative access. Jeff, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's a risk decision, right? If the person doesn't have access to the cafeteria menu, and it's part of the role consolidation, great. If it's somebody who has admin access to the AWS console, okay, that's totally different, right? So
Right.
I feel the second way there that you were talking about, Jim, it's more of a risk decision. Don't waste time fighting a battle over something silly and inconsequential, and focus instead on the stuff that makes you either more secure, reduces risk, or greatly improves the user experience, or ideally all of them.
Right.
So Helio, with the organizations that you've worked with, I mean, how common is it for them to use role mining as a tool, and how is that approached? Is it usually like a whole project around, hey, we're going to do role mining and it's going to be several months, or is it something that just kind of gets ingrained in the operations of things?
Well, role mining is really more part of your program than it is like a simple process. So you can't just jump right into role mining and say, hey, we're going to do role mining. You have to lay the foundation there. So on my projects where we're implementing a new solution, we have nothing to begin with. Role mining is not usually even on the table for those kind of projects. It's the more mature identity systems that are in place. They've connected to a majority of their applications, at least their heavy use applications, and they're trying to understand and just move to that next level with identity, with their identity process. That's really where we want to get, and that's where we're going to get the role mining type projects. Now, with as far as how many of my projects, at least 75-80% have that on their roadmap for part of their Now, are we there yet with all of them? No, but we know that that's where we want to get. So once we get all of our applications in, we're definitely looking down that path. So it is a common thing. We all want to get to that perfect RBAC world where we have everything going through roles, but it's not something you're going to get to on day.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like sometimes when we have these conversations, it takes such an identity and access management consultant perspective to these things. So I actually, as you're talking, I was like, we might need to even take a step back and talk about what are roles, because to me, this is one of those terms that, Jeff and I conduct a lot of workshops together. And we get into these conversations, and the word role is used so differently in different organizations. I think this was one of the topics we discussed in a past podcast. But in terms of RBAC and what we're talking about with roles now is kind of the modern identity and governance and administration review of a role, which is that it's a bundle of accounts and entitlements that can span across applications. If you have, if you took like an application centric focus, so in other words, you didn't have a centralized IAM system, that term role still gets used, that I get a role to an application. That's really what we're talking about with role mining, is combining those types of roles or groups, or what I think we've been referring to as accounts and entitlements, and bundling those into a role within the IGA or IAM system. It's kind of a grouping of accounts and entitlements into a bundle. I guess I'm using the term bundle. I'm kind of making that up, but that's still, that's the role that we're talking about, right? Jeff, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it's, this is nomenclature, right? You have to make sure that everyone's speaking the same language. So role could be an entitlement, within a system. It could also be a collection of entitlements within a system. It can also be a collection of entitlements across different systems. And I don't think there's any right answer, because every organization has a different number of roles, a different number of entitlements, and a different number of applications. I like to think about it to make it easier to start at a top-down type of approach, where the question becomes much simpler to ask. Is the person an employee, or is the person not an employee? That's usually a lot easier to answer to me from a role perspective than to say, is this person a level 1 programmer or a level 2 programmer, right? Or something along those lines. So I like approaching it from two different angles, because I feel like there are attribute-based roles, which is attribute-based access control, or ABAC. And then there's role-based access control, right? RBAC, which is typically assigned more at the job function or, job family or job group type. And I like kind of combining the both. I'm an employee as an attribute, who works in Chicago as another attribute, who works in IT as part of security, right? And the combination of those 4 different things, between those, give me a collection of entitlements, some based on roles because I'm an employee, and some based on roles because I'm in Chicago, and some because I'm part of maybe information security, right? So I think it's important that when you're constructing these, you think about it from what makes sense to the organization. A huge organization with a ton of different departments, locations, user types, meaning employee, contractor, intern, student, however, you may call the different types of people within the organization, will drive a lot of how complex or not complex your role structure needs to be. If you need a lot of granularity and a lot of flexibility, you're going to need to drive it to be more, attribute based along those lines. And then you start to look at the applications on the bottom up to say, okay, we have this new application, and this is the specific permissions or entitlement that go for this specific role. And then you start to do that across applications, et cetera. So I like to tackle it from both sides, but to me, it's easier to start from the top down and figure out what's birthright. What do all employees get? Do non-employees or contractors, they get the same thing? No? Okay, let's move on to the next one.
And kind of speaking to the nomenclature thing, one thing I've found in a lot of projects is the word role, as mentioned, means different things to different people. But when you start talking to application administrators using like SAP as an example, what we call an entitlement in the identity management systems in SAP, that is what they call a role. So an SAP role is an entitlement in identity management systems for the most part. So you really need to set down that this is the jargon we're going to use in this conversation at the beginning. Otherwise, everybody will be on a different page.
You have to be able to explain the concept, right?
Right.
Here's what we're going for. Are we all on the same page here?
Yeah. And I think that's why I was kind of even pointing out, we're using that term. So from a nomenclature standpoint, we're using that term, how it's typically used in the IGA space. Jeff mentioned, am I an employee or am I program level 1, program level 2? Do I work in the Austin office or in the New York office? Well, you know what? I can have multiple. I have different angles of things of where I work and what role I do within the company. I'm an employee or contractor. I can have multiple roles as well. And I think what we're talking about here is, kind of provisioning of access roles. That's kind of how I think within the governance space is bundling accounts and entitlements so that I can be provisioned that access to the end systems that I need access to. And this is something that I wanted to kick back to Helio because, you've been spending the last, I don't know how long. Normally we ask all of our guests, Helio, how they got into IAM. And maybe we should ask that of you, but also I wanted to point out that, you've been focused on the SailPoint technology for the last decade?
I've been working with SailPoint for, about 6-7 years now.
Okay. And, one of the things that I wanted to point out, because what I run into a lot is, well, first, maybe what you could do for me real quick would be to define, I think they use the terms IT roles and business roles. What are the difference between those two?
Yeah, so an IT role is a collection of entitlements. So you have your various AD groups, your SAP roles, privileges from all of your other applications, all combined into an IT role. Whereas a business role is more of a collection of identities. So that could be based off of, to use Jeff's example, you have employees, a business role. You have contractors, they're a business role. You have people with the location of Chicago, that's a business role, in Atlanta and Tampa and wherever else. So your business roles are collections of people. Your IT roles are collections of entitlements. You can assign the IT roles to the business roles. You can assign the business roles the identities, and then
to the people, right?
And
okay,
then
well, that makes
if you
sense.
have the business role, you get the entitlements of the IT role.
I think this is one of the hard things about IAM is that there's so many different ways to take all these words, right? That's the way that SailPoint does it. Is that the way another IGA vendor does it? Who knows? No. Figure it out.
Right.
There is no standard, I don't think, when it comes to that kind of thing, right? So you have to be able to understand the construct logically of what it is you're trying to do, and then how is the technology going to help you get there, right? Whatever they call it, the end goal is to provide access to the right person at the right time, to the right systems. And if you can do it more efficiently through groupings, right? That's another, sometimes it's a group that's used as the terminology. That's really kind of the end goal.
So here's one thing I wanted to point out. So I want to stay on this SailPoint example because I'm sure that it works. I know that it works this way. So one thing is, let's say we take that role mining example that we talked about for Andrew, where, it runs a data analysis and it mines and says, 95% of the people in HR have these 3 AD groups. Would you like to just give that to 100% of the people? You say yes. So now all the people in HR have these 3 AD groups, and SailPoint considers that an IT role, right? Those 3 groups. Now, wouldn't it also be true that if I was assigned those 3 AD groups, that SailPoint would now think I'm in that role, even if I got those groups by other methods?
Yeah, SailPoint will detect that you have those 3 AD groups and that you are assigned to that role, which is actually quite helpful. when you come to do, say, a certification. Is instead of showing the certifier, hey, they have these 3 AD groups that you have no idea what they actually do, they show, hey, they have this role. Does that make sense? Now, you can also get to the entitlement level, too, in a certification if you wanted to, so you could see those 3. But yes, absolutely. We will, in SailPoint, detect that you have the role, even if you were not directly assigned the role through like a request or through a birthright.
Now, I saw one client who actually, if that was the case, they collected those 3. They bundled those 3 roles. They would add a 4th element, a 4th entitlement, which was kind of like, let me call it a fake entitlement, so that it wouldn't be detected in that. It wouldn't be, somebody who got those other 3 by some other method, not by assignment of the role. It wouldn't be detected by SailPoint as them having that role. Have you ever seen that before?
I have not, but I'd be interested in looking at that system.
Okay. Well, we have a little bit of homework to go into, because either that makes a lot of sense or it's a terrible idea. I'm not sure.
One of the things I'll say is we get all kinds of different requirements, and sometimes we have to do a little bit differently. So,
Yeah. So Helio, I wanted to shift the conversation to role governance. Certification of what a role gives somebody, and then who is in that role. What have you seen? What are the typical processes you see with your clients in terms of, what role governance routines are in place?
well, so in using the SailPoint example as well, so one of the things that we're going to want to do is, to your point, maintain that role. Like I build this role through role mining today. That doesn't mean that in 3 months that role is still going to be valid, and in 3 years it's probably not going to be valid. So there are tools to allow us to do that. We can continue to run the role mining analyses. Let's go with analyses. So we can continue to run the role mining analyses so that we can validate our roles that way. But we also have the ability to certify the contents of the role. So we could do what's called a role composition certification, which is typically performed by the role owner. We'll get a list of all the roles that we own and the contents of those roles and say, hey, yeah, we don't need this AD group in this role anymore because whatever reason, we don't need it. That application is no longer a thing. It could be that we don't want to give that access to people in HR anymore. But we want to maintain those roles so that we're not proliferating incorrect entitlements to everybody. So that's a very important concept.
Yeah, I think that is key part, right? Is roles change over time. So you need some way and some process to make sure that the contents of that role are still accurate, especially if you're relying on roles to grant access to people, right? Otherwise, now the mistakes you make aren't onesie twosies, they're macro in nature, right? Oh, great, 4,000 people, right, now have access to this thing that they shouldn't have access to anymore because nobody was maintaining the role itself and the construction or composition of it. So I think that's a really important thing.
And that's one of the reasons that I say that your identity system is not a one-off. It's a program. It's a process. You have to keep maintaining it. You need, and that never dies.
Preach on, brother. There's one thing that I think that's important is when you're going to, speaking kind of the governance of roles, is that it's a lot easier to not only create but manage roles if you're cleaning up data as you're going along, right? Getting rid of things that you don't need anymore, AD groups that I have no members, roles that don't have any members, things like that. So, that's another way to help kind of streamline the system itself, not only from a performance perspective, but from just a reducing the quantity of things to manage. Is take a look at the data itself and make sure that you're keeping it clean as you go along, or even before you even get into a role, doing a cleanup exercise first before you start building out roles for things that don't exist.
Right. I'll tell a lot of my customers, hey, we don't want to do role mining until we've done at least one certification campaign to know that the entitlements the users have now are the right ones. No, there's no point to mining the entitlements if the entitlements are the wrong entitlements.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, the thing I was going to add, I think that you guys just made the point of garbage in, garbage out. That's spot on. I think the other thing is, you know, the business has got to be a part of this. So if you think that role mining and role engineering can be an IT only job or IT led and the business isn't really taking ownership, it's only going to go so far. I think you can, you know, provision basic access, VPN, email, stuff like that based on, you know, very simple role patterns. However, if you want to get into, you know, what people do in the business and really making access management more efficient, you got to get the business involved. And then you've got to get the metadata on the roles right. You've got to have good descriptions. You've got to have owners for roles. And it's it's not a once and done thing. It's something that's going to have to be revisited pretty often. So it requires a little investment up front. It's like changing the oil in your car. You know, you have to uh, all the maintenance on your car. You do the maintenance so that the car doesn't blow up. And I think that's kind of the same principle with role governance.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we made the point earlier that you really want the names of the roles, you really want the descriptions of the role to be right, because those are going to be end user facing, and that we need to be correct so that people understand what they're doing. No good saying, hey, can you approve access to this? If when I look at it, I go, I don't know what that is. Okay, approve.
And I think this is really where a good IAM program manager steps in, because it's the business, it's their data, right?
Yeah.
And the technology and the roles and all the stuff that goes around it is typically provided by IT or an IT person, you know, maybe even within. But there needs to be structure and order to the way things are done. You know, when I've done role catalogs in the past, for example, you know, I would develop, here is the minimum acceptable level of quality that I will take, you know, for a role name, a role description, you know, anything like that. And if it didn't meet at least, you know, that minimum level of quality, then it would get sent back, right? Either I would work directly with the business and say, hey, we need a better name for this, or, you know, are you sure your users will understand what this means, right? Things like that, rather than just kind of taking the easy way out where you dump all the all the AD group names, you know, that are probably not reader friendly,
But we
and
don't
requires.
want FQDNs in there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So
Well,
I
yeah,
think it's
the
important that the
opposite is
business
just,
is part of this.
the opposite is just as bad. If you just call a role the accounting role,
Right.
or the accounting group. How many times have you seen that the accounting group in AD, and then it gets used for so many things that, you know, you're afraid to, or maybe it's called, you know, accounting finance, and like it was basically set up for some project. Nobody remembers exactly what it was originally intended for, but it's been used so many times, and now they can't delete it or clean it up or identify an owner because it's just a mess. So
Yep.
it's,
And really, all it does is give you access to do your time card.
well, maybe that's what it was intended for originally, and now it's like everybody depends on it for the most critical database in the business. You know,
Right.
that can happen too.
And that's why
Absolutely.
I think you need to have, you know, the structure and order. I mean, you got to think about how do you want to present the data to your users, and then tackle it backwards from there and say, okay, you know, what are the capabilities of the IJ platform that we're using to present this? Or, you know, it could even be in your ITSM tool, right? A lot of organizations may use ServiceNow, for example, to present the request to the user. So you need to take into account what can the technology support, and then design an access catalog that is user friendly off of that. But I still feel the business is part of that. Ultimately, they own the roles. They should be part of the sign off process, as part of, here's what's going to be named, here's the description, here are the specific permissions associated with that. And then periodically they should be asked to review that to make sure that's still accurate. You know, maybe it's yearly, you know, maybe it's shorter if it's something with maybe privileged access or sometimes, but I don't feel like this is something that, to do it right, is fair to just toss it over the IT wall and say, here, IT, you deal with it. The business needs to be part of this process for it to be successful.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's right. Great when everybody agrees.
It's also important too. You know, I think a lot of organizations want to get to RBAC 100%. It's really hard, right? If it wasn't hard, everyone would be doing it. So I think it's a goal to get there, but I don't think that you should shoot for 100%. I think you should shoot for something far more attainable, however you want to define success. And maybe it is at the macro role level, like employee or not employee. And maybe that's as good as you think that is realistic in the first year or maybe even 2 years, right? And then from there, as your IAM program develops and becomes more mature, and you're getting all this data back from tools that you've been working on implementing, if you didn't have an IGA system before, you can start to, do some more roles off that, or even attribute-based, logic off that. But I don't think 100% is a realistic goal. I think shooting for somewhere along the lines of, 80% is good enough is a good target to hit, because what you don't want to do is spend an inordinate amount of time trying to, address a 5% problem, right? Or even
Well, I think as a program manager, my attitude would be, all right, for the IT roles, I need to get this right. I need to have this be the gold standard. And then I have to create a capability so that the business can also, come up to the level of gold standard. But I'm not going to drag them kicking and screaming into the RBAC future. If they're satisfied with, doing entitlements or going through the grog and don't want to invest the time, then, my philosophy to all this is that IT's responsibility is to provide the tools and provide the processes so the business can manage access. I think by, having the gold standard, having the tools, and having a process for, creating roles and assigning roles and recertifying roles, you're doing your job as an IAM program manager. Dragging people kicking and screaming is not going to work. If they're not taking it seriously, you're fighting a losing battle, and you're going to get into that area where they just think it's somebody else's job, and it's not.
And the
it's a
other
lot
thing we
easier to
don't want,
dance.
oh, go
I say it's a lot easier to dance with 2 willing dance partners than just one.
Yeah, the other thing that you don't want to do, to go back to Andrew C's question, was we had 400,000 entitlements. We don't want to get so granular with our roles that we end up having 500,000 roles to maintain.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
There has to be some level of, hey, this is what we want to maintain, and if we get too granular with it, then we're going to have a role for every entitlement and then some roles for every other thing, and then you end up with 500, 600, 700,000 roles to maintain, and then you just made a bigger mess for yourself.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's not only that, but it's so many of the organizations that we work with, and I go in and ask them how many AD groups do they have. It's more than the number of users that they have. Really, what that tells me, and I'm talking security groups, not just distribution lists. That tells me that they've got a lot of groups that somebody created and nobody loves, nobody cares about, nobody's keeping them, and nobody feels like they own them. And that's a problem. If you get in that same position with roles, you're just going to create another nightmare scenario.
And that's where our cleanup campaigns come into place, whether it's through access certifications or whether it's through just looking at the groups and saying, hey, nobody's in these groups. Do we actually need or is really going to help? And that's
right.
You got to do that up front. Got to put in the legwork to get to where you want to get.
I kind of always felt too that with cleanup campaigns, there's some cleanup that you should just do even before you put in an IAM system. And then there's other cleanup that the IAM system through the certification campaigns, for example, can really help you out with. But some of the things like just cleaning up all the empty AD groups, it doesn't seem like you need an expensive IAM system to do that. You can just go through and clean them up.
Yep. Yeah. Here's a script to go pull back all the groups that have no members.
And if you have an attribute on the AD group for owner and half of them are empty, go through and start filling them in. Otherwise,
Yeah,
who are you going to even send the recertification campaign to?
Yeah, absolutely. Having that ownership level, whether it's just for certification campaigns or it's for access review or access requests, having an owner up front in whatever other application we're talking about is very, very helpful.
Yeah, it's usually one of the first things that gets asked is, okay, who owns this, right? And no time like the present to figure out who owns it, because you're going to need it down the road anyway. So it's a cheap, easy way to get started. Maybe not be easy if you have a lot of them, but it's a cheap way to get started, right? Look through, figure out who owns it, assign de facto ownership. If there isn't any historical record, maybe it's based off a ticket, whoever requested it, becomes the owner. And then the other thing too is maintaining that ownership too over the group. For example, if someone leaves the organization, I had a rule in the past where if an owner left, their manager would become ownership and inherit it automatically until they decided to, who they wanted to delegate it to. That way we always had an owner for, a given group or a given entitlement.
And if we can't figure out who the owner is, it's Jim.
That's right. Send it to Jim. He'll figure it out.
The person in the mailroom, just pick the person who runs the mailroom and assign it to them.
All right. Did we cover everything that we wanted to cover today? I feel like we covered a lot of ground. I hope we answered Andrew's question.
Yeah, I hope that Andrew feels that way. So
I'm sure he'll let us know if not, and we'll be happy to tackle it again.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and leave it there for now. Is there any final words of wisdom that Helio, you, or Jim want to bring up before we wrap up?
I'm not a very wise person. So.
No, just thanks to everybody who's been listening and sending us mail, that likes the show or questions, and keep them coming because it makes it really easy to figure out what to talk about when we get these types of notes. Really appreciate it.
And it's more interesting for you because we're talking about what you want to talk about. So rather than, Jim and I putting our heads together, we'd rather talk about things that are important to folks out there. So be sure to take advantage of that email, questions@identityatthecenter.com, or look Jim or I up on LinkedIn and shoot us a note there. We're happy to engage and we're in the IAM world just like most of the folks listening, here are. So we appreciate it. And I think with that, we're going to go ahead and call it a wrap, and hope everyone stays happy and healthy, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.